Tell me, Mr. Walker, the billionaire CEO said with a smile that never reached her eyes. If all you do is mop floors, why should anyone in this room listen to you? The question drifted across the polished boardroom like a challenge wrapped in silk, and for a heartbeat the only sound was the gentle hum of the climate control hidden behind walnut-paneled walls. A few executives exchanged amused glances. Someone quietly chuckled. Another leaned back with folded arms, already convinced the afternoon's most entertaining moment had arrived. None of them noticed that the man standing beside the conference table never looked embarrassed. Ethan Walker simply rested one weathered hand on the handle of his janitor's cart and met Claire Whitmore's gaze with calm blue eyes that carried neither resentment nor fear. He had spent years learning that dignity rarely announced itself. It simply waited. The headquarters of Ardent Dynamics overlooked downtown Chicago from 47 stories above the streets below, where streams of yellow taxis and early evening traffic moved like ribbons of light between glass towers. Inside the executive boardroom, every chair was occupied. Members of the board had flown in from New York, Dallas, Seattle, and Boston for what investors were already calling the most important strategy meeting in company history. Billions of dollars rested on decisions scheduled for that afternoon, yet for reasons no one fully understood except the woman sitting at the head of the table. The meeting had paused for a janitor carrying a bucket and a stack of fresh microfiber cloths. Claire Whitmore, founder, billionaire, and one of the youngest Fortune 500 CEOs in America, folded her hands together as though she were about to begin an ordinary discussion. She was known throughout the business world for making impossible decisions without raising her voice. Magazine covers celebrated her brilliance. Competitors feared her discipline. Employees respected her impossible standards. Rumors followed her wherever she went. Some claimed she could recognize dishonesty within seconds. Others insisted she tested people when they least expected it. Only Claire knew which stories were true. She glanced toward the long wall of windows where the afternoon sun painted golden reflections across the skyline before returning her attention to Ethan. "Would you stay for just a moment?" she asked politely. Ethan nodded once. "Of course, ma'am." His voice was steady, warm, and surprisingly confident for someone wearing Navy maintenance coveralls instead of an expensive tailored suit. He quietly rolled his cleaning cart beside the wall and waited. Several directors looked visibly confused. One whispered, "Is this some kind of leadership exercise?" Another muttered, "Maybe Human Resources scheduled another workplace seminar." Someone farther down the table smiled and said under his breath, "Or maybe we're about to promote the cleaning crew." Laughter floated softly around the room. Ethan heard every word. He answered none of them. Instead, he glanced briefly at the family photograph tucked inside the front pocket of his cart. A little blonde girl with missing front teeth smiled back beside a pumpkin nearly as large as she was. Lily Walker, 10 years old. The reason every morning began before sunrise. The reason every evening ended with homework, frozen waffles, library books, and whispered promises that tomorrow would always be better than today. Ethan had long ago stopped measuring success by titles or office size. He measured it by whether he arrived at his daughter's school before dismissal every afternoon. Nothing mattered more. Claire noticed the photograph. She noticed the gentle way Ethan slid it farther inside the pocket, as if protecting something priceless. She noticed that while executives around the table competed for attention, the janitor standing quietly against the wall never attempted to make himself important. That interested her more than any resume ever had. "Mr. Walker," Claire finally continued, her tone perfectly composed, "I've heard something unusual about you." The room became noticeably quieter. Ethan offered the smallest smile. "People say a lot of unusual things." "They do," Claire agreed. "Some say you see problems differently." Another executive laughed openly this time. "Claire, with respect, if our maintenance staff can solve a $12 billion strategic problem, we've all chosen the wrong profession." More laughter followed, louder now, bouncing gently off the glass walls before fading into comfortable certainty. Ethan remained perfectly still. He neither defended himself nor reacted. His silence wasn't surrender. It was patience. Outside, clouds drifted across the Chicago skyline, dimming the sunlight for only a moment before brightness returned. Inside the boardroom, no one realized they had already mistaken the quietest person in the room for the least important one. Within the next few minutes, Every assumption sitting around that polished table would begin to unravel, not because a janitor demanded respect, but because genuine wisdom never needed to ask for permission to be heard. Ethan Walker had never imagined that the most valuable lesson he would teach his daughter would come from a mop instead of a college degree. Every weekday began at 4:30 in the morning, long before the first commuter train rattled across the city and long before the lights inside Ardent Dynamics flickered to life. His small two-bedroom apartment on the northwest side of Chicago remained quiet except for the gentle whistle of the coffee maker and the soft creak of old hardwood floors beneath careful footsteps. He always packed Lily's lunch before making his own breakfast, because she insisted peanut butter sandwiches tasted better when her father cut them into triangles. It had become one of those tiny traditions that survived every difficult season of their lives. While oatmeal simmered on the stove, Ethan ironed Lily's school uniform with the same patience he once used for technical blueprints many years earlier. At exactly 6:15, he knocked gently on her bedroom door. "Sunrise, kiddo." A sleepy voice answered through a yawn. "5 more minutes, Daddy." Ethan smiled to himself. "You said that yesterday." "I know," she replied. "It worked yesterday." He laughed quietly, and for a few precious moments the apartment felt wonderfully ordinary. Lily eventually emerged wearing oversized socks that never seemed to match and carrying a stuffed rabbit whose ears had become permanently crooked after years of bedtime adventures. She climbed onto the kitchen stool while Ethan poured orange juice into her favorite blue cup decorated with tiny white stars. "Big spelling test today?" he asked. She nodded confidently. "I studied every word, even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones." Ethan reached across the table and gently tapped the tip of her nose. "That is my girl." There had been a time when mornings looked very different. Before illness entered their lives. Before hospital hallways replaced family vacations. Before his wife, Emily, whispered her final request from a quiet room filled with afternoon sunlight. "Promise me one thing," she had said as Ethan held her hand. "Make sure Lily grows up believing kindness is never weakness." Those words had never left him. They followed him through every difficult paycheck, every lonely evening, every unexpected setback, and every silent sacrifice nobody else ever noticed. After dropping Lily at school each morning, Ethan drove his aging pickup truck toward downtown Chicago. The truck had crossed nearly 200,000 miles. The paint had faded under years of Midwest winters, and the heater only worked when it felt generous. But it always started. Ethan appreciated dependable things. They reminded him that appearances rarely told the whole story. By 7:30, he was already polishing marble floors, replacing light bulbs, fixing loose cabinet hinges, or quietly solving the small problems that allowed everyone else inside the building to focus on larger ones. Most employees barely noticed him. Some greeted him warmly. Others walked past while talking into expensive wireless headsets without ever lifting their eyes. Ethan never seemed offended. Invisible work still mattered because someone had to do it well. During lunch, he usually sat alone in a quiet maintenance room with a paperback novel borrowed from the public library and a homemade turkey sandwich wrapped neatly in wax paper. The younger maintenance workers often asked why he never complained about working harder than people who earned 10 times his salary. Ethan always answered the same way. "Your job pays the bills. Your character builds your life." They usually smiled politely, thinking it sounded like something an old football coach might say. None of them realized he believed every word. That afternoon, only a few hours before the extraordinary board meeting, Ethan had paused beside the enormous lobby windows while wiping fingerprints from the glass. The autumn sun reflected across Lake Michigan in long bands of silver, and for a brief moment, he caught his own reflection staring back, gray beginning to appear near his temples. Strong hands roughened by years of honest work. Gentle eyes carrying memories he rarely shared. He looked nothing like the ambitious young engineer he had once been, yet strangely he felt more complete than ever. His phone vibrated softly inside his pocket. A message from Lily appeared across the screen. 100 on my spelling test. Love you, Daddy. Ethan's smile arrived instantly. He typed back before slipping the phone away. I never doubted you. Save me one celebration hug after school. He had no way of knowing that before the final school bell rang that afternoon, the quiet routine protecting their simple life would begin changing forever. Claire Whitmore had spent her entire career proving that intelligence could build an empire, but experience had taught her something far more valuable than financial success. Intelligence could solve problems. Character decided what people did after the problems were solved. That belief had become the invisible foundation beneath every decision she made as the leader of Ardent Dynamics. Newspapers often described her as fearless. Business magazines called her America's most disciplined chief executive officer. Television interviews admired her calm confidence and relentless pursuit of excellence. Very few people ever asked why she trusted so few individuals despite leading more than 12,000 employees across the country. The answer lived quietly inside memories she rarely shared. Years earlier, before Ardent Dynamics became one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America, Claire had built her first prototype inside a rented warehouse with 3 folding tables, 2 aging desktop computers, and fewer than $10,000 left in her savings account. She remembered the investors who smiled politely before rejecting her. She remembered talented executives who promised loyalty only to leave when larger companies offered higher salaries. She remembered shaking hands with people who praised integrity in public while negotiating very different deals behind closed doors. Those experiences never made her bitter. They made her observant. Over time, she developed an unusual habit that confused even her closest advisors. She never judged people during formal interviews because everyone prepared for interviews. She watched how they treated receptionists. She listened to how they spoke to assistants. She noticed whether they thanked the cafeteria staff or ignored them completely. She quietly believed that respect shown to someone with no power revealed more truth than compliments offered to someone with authority. That philosophy had transformed her company culture. Every executive understood that titles earned responsibility, not privilege. Every employee knew kindness mattered just as much as performance. Yet even with those principles firmly established, Claire still felt something was missing. The company had grown so quickly that many senior leaders had become obsessed with presentations, forecasts, and quarterly numbers. Meetings grew longer while genuine listening became shorter. Brilliant people competed to sound like the smartest person in every room. Claire wondered if anyone still possessed the confidence to remain quiet until something meaningful needed to be said. That question had stayed with her for months. Then, almost by accident, she noticed Ethan Walker. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday before sunrise. Claire had arrived unusually early after returning from a flight to Seattle. The building remained almost empty except for security personnel and maintenance staff preparing the offices before the workday began. As she stepped out of the elevator carrying a stack of briefing folders, one page slipped loose and drifted across the marble floor. Before she could reach it, Ethan calmly picked it up, straightened the slightly folded corner, and handed it back with a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am." "Thank you," Claire replied. She expected him to recognize her immediately, but he simply nodded and continued replacing a ceiling light without another word. There was no attempt at conversation, no request for a photograph, no mention of promotions or personal favors, just quiet professionalism. It surprised her. During the following weeks, she noticed similar moments. Ethan patiently helped a new intern locate the correct conference room after the young man became hopelessly lost. He repaired a broken wheelchair ramp before anyone submitted a maintenance request. He stayed late one rainy evening helping an elderly delivery driver unload heavy supply boxes even though his own shift had already ended. None of those acts appeared in company reports. Nobody applauded. Ethan never mentioned them. Claire only knew because she happened to witness them herself. Curiosity slowly replaced coincidence. She asked the facilities manager about Ethan. The answer was simple. "Best employee I have. Never complains. Never misses work. Solves problems before anybody notices them." Claire requested his personnel file later that afternoon, expecting little more than routine employment records. Instead, she discovered something strangely incomplete. Basic information filled the first pages. Employment history, emergency contact, maintenance certifications. Then there were noticeable gaps. Several years seemed almost invisible, followed by sealed recommendation letters that had never been opened because they were marked confidential by a previous employer. Claire rested her fingertips on the folder for several quiet seconds. Companies rarely received confidential recommendations. Something about Ethan Walker's past had been intentionally protected. She closed the file slowly and looked through the glass wall of her office toward the maintenance crew working silently below. A question formed in her mind, calm but persistent. Who was the man everyone walked past every single day without ever truly seeing? The answer to Claire's question arrived sooner than she expected, and it did not come from a confidential letter or an executive report. It arrived on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon wrapped in the quiet rhythm of people doing jobs no one celebrated. The headquarters buzzed with unusual energy as final preparations were underway for the quarterly board meeting. Catering staff rolled polished carts through the hallways. Information technology specialists checked presentation screens one last time. Administrative assistants hurried between offices carrying folders, coffee orders, and updated schedules. Everyone focused on the executives who would soon gather upstairs. Almost no one noticed the maintenance team moving silently behind the scenes, making certain every detail worked exactly as intended. Ethan had just finished replacing an air filter on the 39th floor when he heard a faint electronic chirp echo through the ventilation corridor. It repeated every few seconds, almost hidden beneath the steady hum of the building. Most people would have ignored it. Ethan stopped walking. He listened carefully, tilting his head slightly. Something about the sound felt wrong. He followed it through a narrow service hallway until he reached a utility closet beside the executive conference center. Kneeling beside an electrical cabinet, he removed the access panel and quietly studied the indicator lights. One small backup power module had begun cycling unpredictably. The building still appeared perfectly normal, but if the unit failed during the upcoming board meeting, every interactive display, secure video connection, and digital presentation system on the executive floor could suddenly shut down. Ethan checked his watch. Less than 40 minutes remained before directors from across the country would begin presenting a strategy involving billions of dollars in future investments. He reached for his radio, then paused. Calling outside contractors would take too long. Filing paperwork would accomplish nothing before the meeting started. He opened his toolbox instead. For the next 20 minutes, he worked patiently, replacing a damaged relay, recalibrating the backup circuit, and manually testing every connection until the warning light finally disappeared. The soft chirping stopped. Silence returned. Ethan smiled to himself, closed the cabinet, and carefully documented the repair inside the maintenance log before continuing toward his next assignment as though nothing remarkable had happened. 10 minutes later, Claire entered the boardroom to review final presentation materials. Everything operated flawlessly. The enormous digital display illuminated instantly. Secure communication links connected without interruption. Financial models loaded in seconds. The technology director frowned slightly while reviewing the system diagnostics. "That is strange," he murmured. "We were expecting an equipment warning this afternoon." Claire looked up from her notes. Did someone replace the module already? He checked the maintenance record on his tablet. Apparently, one of the janitors handled it before we even submitted the service request. Claire glanced toward the electronic log. One name appeared beside the completed repair. Ethan Walker. She quietly excused herself and walked into the service corridor. Ethan was wiping fingerprints from a brass handrail outside the executive elevator. He looked up politely as she approached. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Claire held up the maintenance report. "You prevented a system failure, did not you?" Ethan glanced at the document before offering a modest nod. It was only a small relay beginning to wear out. Better to replace it before it became a bigger problem. "Do you realize how important today's meeting is?" she asked. Ethan smiled gently. "Every meeting is important to the people inside the room." Claire studied him for several seconds. Most employees would have emphasized how much money they had saved the company. Others might have expected recognition or a bonus. Ethan simply adjusted the cloth draped over his shoulder and prepared to continue working. "Why did you not tell anyone?" Claire finally asked. "Because the problem was fixed," Ethan answered. "People should spend their energy on tomorrow instead of celebrating what should have worked today." The simplicity of his response lingered in the quiet hallway long after the words ended. Claire watched him walk away with his cart, greeting a receptionist by name before stopping to hold the elevator for an elderly courier struggling with several heavy packages. Again, there was no audience. Again, there was no expectation of praise. That evening, Claire returned to her office instead of heading home. She opened Ethan's personnel file once more, but this time she was not searching for qualifications. She was searching for understanding. Somewhere behind the ordinary maintenance reports and incomplete employment records was a man whose habits reflected unusual discipline, uncommon humility, and a mind trained to solve problems before anyone else realized they existed. Claire slowly closed the folder and looked through the glass wall toward the lights shimmering across Chicago. The board meeting scheduled for the following day suddenly felt less important than the question forming quietly in her mind. She no longer wondered whether Ethan Walker possessed hidden ability. She wanted to discover how a man carrying such quiet confidence had chosen a life where almost everyone overlooked him every single day. The following morning arrived beneath a pale October sky, and the city seemed to awaken more slowly than usual beneath a blanket of low drifting clouds. Inside ardent dynamics, however, the pace had already become relentless. The annual strategic board meeting would begin before noon, bringing together directors, investors, and senior executives responsible for guiding the company's next decade. Every conference room had been reserved. Every presentation had been rehearsed. Every assistant moved with quiet urgency through polished hallways that reflected the glow of recessed lights above. Ethan Walker noticed none of the excitement changing his routine. At 7:30, he was already replacing fresh coffee supplies in the executive lounge before carefully inspecting every hallway leading toward the boardroom. He believed people thought more clearly in clean spaces, and whether anyone appreciated the effort never changed the quality of his work. While polishing a brass railing outside the executive offices, he overheard two vice presidents speaking as they approached from around the corner. They lowered their voices, believing no one else was listening. "The chief executive officer has been asking questions about the janitor," one of them whispered. "Which one?" the other replied. "Walker. Apparently, she requested his personnel file twice this week." The first executive laughed softly. "Maybe she wants to give him an employee appreciation award." The second man smirked. "Or maybe she is trying to figure out why a maintenance worker keeps solving problems that information technology misses." Their footsteps faded toward the elevators, but their conversation lingered in the quiet corridor. Ethan simply continued wiping the railing until it reflected the morning light like still water. Rumors had a way of growing inside large companies. He had learned years ago that chasing them only made them louder. Meanwhile, on the executive floor, Claire Whitmore sat alone reviewing several sealed documents spread neatly across her conference table. Beside Ethan's personnel folder rested 3 confidential letters forwarded from a previous employer after receiving her authorization request. She had expected ordinary recommendations. Instead, every envelope carried legal confidentiality notices and signatures from individuals whose names immediately caught her attention. One letter came from the former chairman of a respected engineering firm. Another had been written by a university research director. The third remained unopened as Claire quietly considered whether reading it before speaking with Ethan would answer too many questions too soon. She leaned back in her chair and looked toward the Chicago skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Curiosity had slowly become respect, but respect alone was not enough. She needed certainty, not about Ethan's intelligence. She had already seen enough evidence of that. She wanted to understand his judgment. Intelligence without humility had nearly destroyed partnerships earlier in her career. Character revealed itself only when pride was invited into the room. Her assistant gently knocked before stepping inside. "The board members have all arrived." Claire nodded. "Thank you, Melissa. One more thing. Please ask facilities not to assign Mr. Walker anywhere outside the executive floor this morning." Melissa hesitated for only a second. "Certainly." As the door closed again, Claire folded her hands and quietly made a decision. She would not read the remaining letter yet. Paper could describe accomplishments. It could not reveal who someone had become after success disappeared. Across the building, Ethan finished repairing a loose cabinet hinge in the employee break room before receiving a radio call from his supervisor. "Ethan, after you finish on 21, the executive assistant wants you available near the boardroom. They might need help moving equipment." "Understood," Ethan answered calmly. He collected his toolbox and rode the elevator upward, unaware that several curious glances followed him as he crossed the lobby. Word had already begun spreading among employees that the chief executive officer had taken an unusual interest in the quiet janitor. Speculation filled the cafeteria. Some believed he was about to receive a promotion. Others joked that he must have accidentally impressed the wrong executive. A few insisted there had to be some secret hidden inside his past. Ethan ignored every whispered conversation. His thoughts remained focused on simpler things. Lily would finish school at 3:15. She had asked whether they could stop for pumpkin ice cream on the drive home if the weather stayed warm enough. He had promised they would. That promise mattered infinitely more than office gossip. Yet only a few floors above him, the course of his ordinary afternoon was already changing. Claire closed Ethan's personnel file one final time and placed it inside her desk without opening the last sealed recommendation. Then she stood, straightened her navy blazer, and walked toward the boardroom with quiet determination. Some lessons could never be learned from documents. They had to be witnessed in real time, under real pressure, with pride, reputation, and dignity all standing in the same room together. By 11:30, the executive boardroom had become the quiet center of the entire building. Sunlight filtered through the towering glass walls, reflecting across the polished walnut table where 14 directors sat reviewing thick financial reports, projected earnings, and expansion proposals worth billions of dollars. Crystal water glasses rested beside leather portfolios. Fresh coffee filled the air with a rich aroma that blended with the faint scent of polished wood. The room carried the unmistakable feeling that every sentence spoken inside it could change hundreds of careers. Claire Whitmore remained standing at the head of the table, calmly listening as the chief financial officer completed another presentation filled with charts, forecasts, and carefully rehearsed conclusions. Based on current projections, he finished confidently. Our recommendation is to approve the acquisition before the end of the quarter. Claire looked around the room without immediately responding. Every executive appeared satisfied. Every graph pointed upward. Every conclusion sounded polished. Yet something about the discussion felt incomplete. She folded her hands and asked one simple question. Has anyone challenged the assumptions behind these numbers? The room became still. Several directors exchanged uncertain glances before one finally answered. We reviewed the data extensively. Claire nodded. I asked whether anyone challenged the assumptions. Silence answered her this time. She walked slowly toward the enormous digital display showing the proposed acquisition timeline. This company has never succeeded because we repeated what everyone expected us to say. We succeeded because someone had the courage to ask the question nobody else considered. A senior board member leaned forward. Do you believe something has been overlooked? Claire looked toward the closed boardroom doors. I believe confidence sometimes becomes too comfortable. She pressed the small intercom button beside her chair. Melissa, would you please ask Mr. Ethan Walker to come inside for a moment? The request echoed through the room like an unexpected note in a familiar song. Several executives looked genuinely confused. One director frowned. The maintenance employee? Another laughed quietly. Perhaps the projector needs cleaning. A few restrained smiles appeared around the table. Claire offered no explanation. Less than a minute later, the doors opened softly. Ethan stepped inside wearing the same neatly pressed maintenance uniform he had worn every day for years. His identification badge rested against his shirt pocket. A clean microfiber cloth remained folded neatly beside a small notepad he carried almost everywhere. He paused respectfully near the entrance. You asked for me, ma'am? Claire smiled politely. Please come in, Mr. Walker. Ethan walked toward the conference table with calm, measured steps. Every eye in the room followed him. Some faces showed curiosity. Others revealed open amusement. One executive whispered just loudly enough for nearby colleagues to hear. This should be interesting. Another quietly replied. Maybe he knows where the missing office supplies went. Soft laughter drifted across the room before fading again. Ethan heard every word exactly as he had heard similar comments throughout many years of invisible work. He neither frowned nor defended himself. He simply waited. Claire noticed the difference immediately. Most people placed unexpectedly before a room filled with powerful executives would either become nervous or eager to impress. Ethan did neither. His breathing remained steady. His shoulders relaxed. His attention focused entirely on the woman speaking to him. Mr. Walker, Claire began. Our leadership team has spent several weeks discussing a strategic expansion. Before this meeting concludes, I would like a fresh perspective. Ethan blinked once, surprised but composed. I am not certain I understand. I would like you to look at this proposal. She handed him a printed summary containing only the essential financial assumptions rather than the confidential details. You do not need to solve it immediately. Simply tell us what you notice. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. The chief operations officer finally spoke. Claire, with respect, surely this is unnecessary. He is a janitor. Claire turned toward him without changing her calm expression. Yes, he is. The executive continued. He is not trained to evaluate acquisitions. Claire answered quietly. Perhaps not. But sometimes people who are not trained to protect an idea are the first to notice when it is incomplete. Ethan looked down at the document without saying a word. The room waited. Seconds passed. Somewhere beyond the windows, a helicopter crossed the Chicago skyline, while the low hum of the building's ventilation system filled the silence. No one realized that the atmosphere inside the boardroom had already begun changing. The laughter that welcomed Ethan into the room had slowly disappeared, replaced by something quieter, something far more uncertain. Claire watched him carefully, not searching for brilliance, not hoping for a miracle, but wondering whether the quiet character she had observed throughout the building would remain unchanged when every important person in the company was watching him at once. Ethan held the printed summary without rushing to speak. His eyes moved slowly across each page, not skimming for impressive numbers, but reading every line as though each sentence deserved the same respect as the person who had written it. Around the table, several executives exchanged impatient glances. One director quietly checked his watch. Another leaned toward the chief financial officer and whispered, "This is exactly why major decisions belong to professionals." The remark earned a few restrained smiles, but Claire remained completely silent. She was no longer watching the proposal. She was watching Ethan. Nearly a full minute passed before he finally looked up. "May I ask a few questions?" he said politely. Claire nodded. "Please." Ethan rested the report gently on the conference table instead of clutching it defensively. "How many customers are expected to remain after the acquisition during the first 18 months? The chief financial officer answered confidently. "Approximately 93% based on our market analysis." Ethan nodded once. "Have any of those customers actually been asked why they chose that company instead of another?" The executive hesitated. "Our consultants analyze customer behavior." Ethan smiled gently. "That was not my question." A quiet pause settled across the room. Claire folded her hands without interrupting. Ethan continued. "Behavior explains what people did yesterday. Conversations often explain what they will do tomorrow." One board member shifted forward in his chair. Another slowly lowered his pen. Ethan glanced back at the report. "Second question. If the acquisition succeeds exactly as projected, what problem will it solve that our customers are asking us to solve today?" The room remained silent again. Finally, the chief operations officer answered. "It increases our market share." Ethan nodded respectfully. "That helps the company. I was asking about the customer." No sarcasm colored his voice. No pride hid beneath his words. He sounded genuinely curious, as though everyone present were simply working together to understand something important. The silence became noticeably heavier. Outside the glass walls, bright autumn sunlight reflected across neighboring skyscrapers, while drifting clouds cast slow-moving shadows over the city below. Inside the boardroom, the confidence that had filled the meeting only minutes earlier began giving way to thoughtful uncertainty. Ethan studied one chart showing projected cost reductions. "May I ask one more?" Claire smiled faintly. "As many as you need." Ethan looked toward the financial team. "These savings come from combining departments, correct?" "Yes," the chief financial officer replied. "That creates efficiency." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes it does." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Who calculated the cost of losing the people who quietly keep those departments working every day?" The executive frowned. "That is difficult to measure." "Exactly," Ethan answered softly. "The most valuable things often are." Several people around the table looked at one another. A senior director who had laughed earlier slowly removed his glasses and leaned closer to the report in front of him. Claire noticed every reaction without saying a word. Ethan turned one final page before placing the proposal neatly back on the polished table. "I do not believe your numbers are wrong." The chief financial officer allowed himself a small relieved smile. Ethan continued. "I believe they are incomplete." The smile disappeared. "This proposal measures revenue, expenses, staffing, logistics, and market growth very carefully. Those are important, but I cannot find a single place where it measures trust. One executive frowned. Trust is not a financial metric. Ethan looked toward him kindly. No, it becomes a financial result. Nobody laughed this time. Ethan spoke with the calm certainty of someone describing a sunrise rather than winning an argument. People stay with companies because they feel understood. Employees remain because they believe someone notices their work. Customers return because they trust promises more than advertisements. If this acquisition weakens any of those three things, the spreadsheet will not warn you until it is too late. The room grew so quiet that the faint ticking of an elegant wall clock suddenly became noticeable. Claire slowly rose from her chair and walked toward the large digital display. She looked at the colorful projections that had seemed so convincing less than an hour earlier. Then she turned back toward Ethan. If you were sitting in this chair, she asked calmly, what would you do before approving this acquisition? Ethan answered without hesitation, but with complete humility. I would spend one day talking to the employees who answer customer calls. One day visiting the clients who have stayed the longest. One day asking the maintenance staff in both companies what problems they fix every week that leadership never hears about. After that, I would make the decision. No one spoke. Somewhere in that extraordinary silence, the meeting stopped feeling like a test for a janitor. It quietly became a lesson for everyone else in the room. For several long moments, no one reached for a keyboard, no one turned another page, and no one attempted to rescue the conversation with polished corporate language. The silence inside the boardroom no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt revealing. Claire Whitmore slowly walked toward the large whiteboard mounted beside the digital display. She picked up a black marker, looked at the complicated acquisition charts covering the screen, and then calmly switched the display off. The colorful graphs disappeared, leaving only the reflection of 14 executives staring back at themselves through the dark glass. Claire placed the marker in Ethan's hand. Would you show us what you mean? She asked. Ethan looked at the marker for a brief second before shaking his head politely. I am not here to teach anyone. Claire smiled gently. Perhaps not, but you might help us see something we have missed. Ethan hesitated only long enough to be certain she was sincere. Then he walked toward the whiteboard with the same quiet pace he used while carrying a mop through the hallways every morning. He stood before the empty board for several seconds without writing a single word. Behind him, a few executives exchanged uncertain looks. One finally whispered, "Does he even know where to begin?" Ethan uncapped the marker and drew 3 simple circles connected by 2 straight lines. Nothing more. No complicated diagrams. No technical formulas. Just 3 circles. He labeled the first circle company, the second circle people, the third circle trust. Then he stepped back. Every business decision eventually passes through these 3 things, he said calmly. When one becomes stronger, the other 2 should become stronger as well. If one grows while another becomes weaker, the success usually does not last. The chief financial officer folded his arms. That is a very simple model. Ethan nodded. The strongest ideas usually are. He drew an arrow from company to people. A company serves people. Then another arrow from people to trust. People build trust. Finally, he connected trust back to company. Trust allows the company to keep serving people. He lowered the marker. Break any one of these connections, and the numbers may still look impressive for a while, but eventually the system begins working against itself. A director who had spent more than 30 years leading manufacturing operations leaned forward. How would you test whether trust is increasing or decreasing? Ethan answered almost immediately. I would start by asking one question in every department. The executive raised an eyebrow. Only one. Ethan smiled. If your child came to work here tomorrow, would you hope they stayed? The room became quiet again. Ethan continued in the same measured voice. People answer surveys politely. They answer that question honestly. Claire watched several board members slowly lower their eyes toward the conference table. She recognized the expression. They were no longer evaluating Ethan. They were evaluating themselves. Ethan returned to the whiteboard and added one final sentence beneath the 3 circles. Problems ignored become expenses. He gently tapped the words with the marker. Maintenance teaches this lesson every day. A small leak becomes a ruined ceiling. A loose wire becomes a failed system. A forgotten conversation becomes a resignation letter. The repair always costs less than the replacement. Nobody interrupted him. The examples sounded ordinary, yet every person in the room understood exactly what he meant. Claire quietly glanced toward the acquisition proposal resting unopened on the conference table. Suddenly, the hundreds of pages felt strangely incomplete beside a few words written on a whiteboard. The chief operations officer slowly cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, have you studied organizational leadership?" Ethan shook his head. "Not formally." "Business strategy?" "Not in a classroom." "Then where did you learn to think this way?" Ethan looked down at the marker resting loosely in his hand before answering. "By paying attention. Floors teach you where people actually walk, not where architects expected them to walk. Broken equipment teaches you which shortcuts people take when they are under pressure. Quiet work gives you time to notice patterns that busy people sometimes miss." His answer settled gently across the room. No one smiled. No one whispered. The laughter that had greeted him less than an hour earlier had disappeared so completely that it almost felt as though it had never existed. Claire realized she had been searching for intelligence inside confidential files when the greater answer had been quietly polishing floors in front of everyone every single day. She looked once more at the three circles on the whiteboard. They were almost childlike in their simplicity, yet somehow they had accomplished what weeks of presentations had failed to do. They had transformed a room full of experts into a room full of listeners. No one asked Ethan to return the marker. Somehow it remained in his hand, as though the room itself had quietly agreed that the discussion no longer belonged to titles or job descriptions. Claire Whitmore looked around the conference table and saw something she had not witnessed in months. Every executive was thinking instead of preparing their next argument. It was exactly the kind of silence she valued most. It was earned, not imposed. Finally, the chief financial officer leaned forward, adjusting his glasses before speaking with measured professionalism. "Mr. Walker, your observations are thoughtful, but our recommendation is supported by 3 independent consulting firms, extensive market research, and nearly 6 months of financial analysis. Surely you are not suggesting all of that work is flawed?" Ethan smiled politely. "No, sir. I believe your work is valuable." The executive relaxed slightly. Ethan continued, "I simply believe valuable information can still be incomplete." The chief operations officer folded his hands together. Now entire industries compete to improve it. Trust often begins as something invisible until one day its absence becomes impossible to ignore. A senior director who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting slowly leaned forward. His name was Robert Hayes, a man who had served on corporate boards for nearly 30 years. "Mr. Walker," he said calmly, "have we met before?" Ethan looked at him for a moment before gently shaking his head. "I do not believe so, sir." Robert studied him carefully. "That voice sounds familiar." Ethan offered only a courteous smile. "Perhaps you have heard someone else with a similar one." The conversation moved on, but Robert did not stop watching him. Something continued to trouble his memory. Across the table, another executive spoke up. "Let us assume your concerns are correct. What specifically would you change in this proposal?" Ethan walked back toward the printed summary and quietly turned to the page showing the integration schedule. "The timeline," he answered. "I would slow the first 90 days. Several eyebrows immediately rose. The chief financial officer frowned. "Investors expect rapid integration." Ethan nodded. "Employees expect thoughtful leadership." The executive responded almost instantly. "Speed creates value." Ethan answered just as calmly. "Only if people can keep up with it." He pointed gently to one section of the report. "This plan combines customer support centers in 6 weeks. On paper, that saves money immediately. In reality, those employees are carrying years of relationships that cannot be transferred through an electronic spreadsheet." Another director challenged him. "Relationships adapt." Ethan smiled. "They do. Trust does not always adapt at the same speed." The room fell quiet once again. Ethan continued without raising his voice. "If one experienced employee leaves because they feel unheard, they often take years of invisible knowledge with them. You replace the position. You rarely replace the wisdom." Claire noticed several executives quietly making handwritten notes. Earlier that morning, they had been smiling at the idea of listening to a janitor. Now they were recording his observations word for word. Robert Hayes suddenly looked toward Claire. "May I see his personnel file?" Claire hesitated for only a second. After the meeting, Robert nodded but never looked away from Ethan. I have been trying to remember where I have seen that way of thinking before. Ethan remained completely unaware of the conversation happening around him. His attention stayed fixed on the proposal. May I ask everyone one final question? Claire gestured warmly. Please. Ethan looked around the room, making eye contact with each director one by one. When this acquisition is announced, what story do you hope employees tell their families over dinner that evening? No one answered immediately. Ethan continued softly. People rarely remember quarterly reports. They remember how leadership made them feel during change. The words settled over the room with unexpected weight. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the three circles still drawn across the whiteboard. Company, people, trust. They no longer looked like simple words. They looked like principles. Robert Hayes slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them carefully on the conference table. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, I have heard someone explain leadership exactly like this before, but it was not inside a boardroom. It was nearly 12 years ago. Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but for the first time since entering the room, Claire noticed something almost impossible to detect. A brief flicker crossed his eyes. Not fear, not pride, recognition. It disappeared so quickly that anyone else might have missed it, but Claire did not. In that quiet moment, she realized the greatest secret in Ethan Walker's life had not yet been revealed. It had only begun knocking gently on the door. Robert Hayes remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Ethan as though an old photograph had suddenly come to life. Around the conference table, the other directors noticed the unusual expression on the veteran board member's face. Claire Whitmore quietly stepped closer. Robert, she asked gently, what is it? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more at Ethan before speaking in a voice that carried more curiosity than certainty. About 12 years ago, I attended a private leadership summit in Boston. There was one speaker none of us had ever heard of before. He was not the oldest person in the room. He was not the most famous either. But after he finished, every executive stayed in their seats because no one wanted to be the first to break the silence. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Robert continued. He drew 3 circles on a whiteboard. Company, people, trust. A quiet wave of surprise moved across the room. Claire slowly turned toward Ethan. Was that you? Ethan remained silent for several seconds before answering honestly. Yes. No one spoke. The simple word seemed almost too small for the weight it carried. Robert leaned forward with growing disbelief. You were Ethan Walker, the systems architect from Meridian Strategic Labs. Ethan nodded once. I was. Another director immediately opened a laptop, searching through old professional archives. Meridian Strategic Labs, he whispered. That company pioneered adaptive logistics software more than a decade ago. Claire looked from the screen back to Ethan. You work there? Ethan answered quietly. For several years. Robert shook his head slowly, still struggling to reconcile the memory before him with the man wearing a maintenance uniform. Work there? You designed the operational framework that every speaker discussed for the rest of that conference. Your presentation changed how several Fortune 500 companies approached organizational planning. Ethan offered a gentle smile that carried no pride. Many talented people contributed to that work. Robert looked almost frustrated. Then why did you disappear? Your name vanished. Every article stopped. Every conference lost track of you. The room waited. Ethan rested both hands lightly on the back of an empty chair before answering. Because my wife became sick. The boardroom grew perfectly still. His voice never trembled, yet every word carried the quiet weight of memory. Emily was diagnosed shortly after Lily was born. At first we believed treatment would allow life to continue normally. It did not. He paused briefly, not searching for sympathy, but choosing his words carefully. Projects became less important than appointments. Promotions became less important than afternoons together. Recognition became less important than hearing my daughter laugh while her mother still could. Claire felt the room changing again, not through surprise this time, but through understanding. Ethan continued in the same calm tone. Eventually, I was offered a promotion that required constant travel. It would have doubled my salary. He smiled softly, remembering. Emily told me to accept it. She believed opportunities like that only came once. He looked toward the Chicago skyline beyond the windows. I told her that watching Lily grow up with both of her parents was an opportunity that also came only once. Robert quietly removed his glasses again. No one interrupted. Ethan continued. I resigned 2 weeks later. We sold our house, moved into a smaller apartment, and I spent every day I could beside my family. A long silence followed before Claire gently asked, "Do you regret that decision?" Ethan answered immediately, "Never." His eyes reflected neither sadness nor longing, only peace. Careers can be rebuilt. Childhood cannot. Time with someone you love cannot be replaced after it is gone. Several executives lowered their eyes toward the table. One director slowly closed the expensive presentation folder in front of him, as though quarterly projections suddenly seemed much less significant. Ethan smiled faintly as another memory surfaced. During Emily's final week, she asked me for only one promise. She wanted Lily to grow up believing that kindness was never weakness. I have simply been trying to keep that promise ever since. Claire felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. She finally understood why Ethan never sought recognition, why he never mentioned his past, and why every quiet act of service inside the building carried such remarkable consistency. He had not stepped away from success because he lacked ambition. He had stepped away because he understood something far more valuable than success itself. Around the boardroom, no one looked at the maintenance uniform anymore. They saw only a father who had measured his life by faithfulness instead of applause. And in that extraordinary silence, every title around the conference table suddenly felt much smaller than the quiet dignity of the man standing before them. Claire Whitmore slowly walked away from the windows and toward the center of the boardroom, her footsteps barely audible against the thick carpet. The afternoon sunlight had shifted, casting long golden reflections across the polished conference table, where only an hour earlier several people had quietly laughed at the maintenance employee standing near the door. She looked around the room before finally speaking. "I owe everyone here an explanation." Every face turned toward her. Ethan remained standing beside the whiteboard, his hands folded calmly in front of him, saying nothing. Claire rested one hand lightly against the back of her chair. This meeting was never only about an acquisition. A few directors exchanged puzzled glances. The chief financial officer frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Claire met his eyes without hesitation. "For the past 6 months, I have been asking myself a question that no quarterly report could answer. Our company continues growing. Our profits continue increasing. Yet I have become concerned that some of us are beginning to mistake confidence for wisdom." No one interrupted. "I wanted to know whether we still recognize character when it appeared without a title." Her voice remained calm, almost reflective. "That is why I asked Mr. Walker into this room." A senior executive looked genuinely surprised. "You planned this?" Claire nodded. "Not every detail. But yes, I wanted to observe something much more important than business knowledge." She looked briefly toward Ethan before continuing. "I wanted to see how a person responded when placed in an uncomfortable situation with every advantage stacked against them." The room grew completely still. Some people reveal their character when they receive authority. Others reveal it when they are denied respect. Those moments tell us far more than any interview ever could. Several board members quietly lowered their eyes. Claire did not speak with accusation. She spoke with honesty. Mr. Walker entered this room wearing a maintenance uniform while surrounded by executives with impressive titles, advanced degrees, and decades of experience. Some people smiled. Some quietly joked. Some assumed they already understood his value before he spoke a single sentence. She allowed the words to settle before continuing. "He never corrected anyone. He never reminded us of his accomplishments. He never defended his past. He simply answered every question with patience and respect." The silence became almost tangible. The chief operations officer slowly leaned back in his chair and exhaled quietly. Claire continued. "That was the real test." She turned fully toward Ethan. "Not whether you could solve a business problem." Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. Claire smiled warmly for the first time that afternoon. "The real test was whether your dignity depended on other people's opinions." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering softly. "It never has." Claire nodded, almost as though she had expected that response from the beginning. "I know." She faced the board once more. "This morning, every person in this room witnessed something remarkable. We watched a man who once advised major corporations choose humility over recognition. We watched someone with every reason to prove himself decide instead to serve quietly. We watched intelligence refuse to become arrogance." Robert Hayes slowly spoke from across the table. "Claire, I have attended leadership conferences for more than 3 decades. I cannot remember another meeting that taught me more than this one. Several directors nodded silently. One executive who had laughed when Ethan first entered the room finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. I judged your uniform before I listened to your words." Ethan smiled gently. "Thank you. Nothing more. No lecture. No attempt to make the man uncomfortable. Just gratitude." The simplicity of the response seemed to humble the room even further. Claire noticed it immediately. Grace, she thought, was often quieter than victory. She walked toward the whiteboard where the 3 circles still remained untouched. Company, people, trust. She placed her fingertips beneath the final word. "Every strategic plan we approve after today will begin here." She looked around the room one final time. "If a decision strengthens the company while weakening people, we will rethink it. If it grows revenue while diminishing trust, we will rethink it. Success without character is simply another form of failure waiting for the right moment." No one reached for their laptops. No one checked a telephone. No one looked toward the clock. The meeting had quietly become something entirely different from what anyone expected. Ethan glanced once through the windows toward the bright autumn sky beyond the Chicago skyline. Somewhere across the city, Lily's school day would soon be ending. He smiled almost imperceptibly. Whatever happened next inside this remarkable boardroom, he had already received something more valuable than recognition. He had kept the promise he made to Emily many years before. Without ever raising his voice, kindness had once again proven that it was never weakness. The boardroom remained quiet long after Claire Whitmore finished speaking. No one seemed eager to break the stillness because everyone understood they had just experienced something far more meaningful than an ordinary business meeting. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent across the Chicago skyline, bathing the glass towers in warm amber light. Inside, the atmosphere had changed completely. The expensive suits, polished presentations, and impressive titles no longer felt like the most important things in the room. Claire slowly returned to her seat before looking directly at Ethan. "Mr. Walker," she said gently, "I have one final request." Ethan nodded respectfully. "Of course." Claire folded her hands together. "Several years ago, I promised myself that if I ever found someone whose judgment I trusted more than their resume, I would ask them to help shape this company's future." Ethan listened quietly without reacting. "Today," Claire continued, "I believe I have found that person." A faint murmur passed around the conference table, but no one objected. In fact, several directors appeared to expect exactly what she was about to say. Claire reached into a leather portfolio and removed a neatly prepared folder. She placed it on the table in front of Ethan. "I would like to offer you the position of Senior Strategic Advisor to the Office of the Chief Executive Officer." Even after everything that had happened during the afternoon, the announcement still surprised everyone in the room. The position carried extraordinary influence. It would place Ethan beside the executive leadership team on the company's most important decisions. The compensation alone exceeded what many senior executives earned after decades of service. Claire continued before anyone else could speak. "You would report directly to me. Your responsibility would not be to manage departments. It would be to remind us when we begin overlooking the people who quietly make this company work." Ethan looked down at the unopened folder for several long seconds. He did not reach for it. He did not ask about salary, benefits, stock options, or executive privileges. Instead, he asked a question so unexpected that several directors looked at one another in surprise. "May I ask what the working hours would be?" Claire smiled softly. "Reasonable." "What?" Ethan answered with complete sincerity. "Because every afternoon at 3:15 my daughter finishes school. I have picked her up almost every day since her mother passed away. I made her a promise that no matter how busy life became, she would never have to wonder whether her father was coming." The room fell silent once more. Claire did not respond immediately. She simply looked at Ethan with growing admiration. "If accepting this position means breaking that promise," Ethan continued, "then I cannot accept it." Nobody around the table questioned his priorities. Nobody laughed. They had all learned too much that afternoon to mistake devotion for lack of ambition. Claire slowly closed the folder she had offered him. For just a brief moment, Ethan wondered whether the opportunity had quietly disappeared. Instead, Claire stood and gently slid the folder back toward him once again. "Then let us change the position instead of changing the promise." Ethan looked up. Claire smiled warmly. Your schedule will end every weekday at 2:45. If a meeting continues beyond that time, we will continue without you until the following morning. Ethan blinked, almost unable to believe what he had heard. Claire continued, leadership should never require someone to abandon the people who matter most. If this company truly believes everything we discussed today, then we must begin living it ourselves. Robert Hayes smiled broadly. I second that. One by one, every director around the conference table nodded in agreement. The motion passed without a single objection. Claire extended her hand across the table. Mr. Walker, would you consider helping us build a company where character remains more valuable than status? Ethan looked at her hand before quietly accepting it. Yes, he answered. On one condition. Claire laughed gently. There is another one. Ethan smiled. Please let the maintenance department hire someone wonderful before you move me anywhere. They deserve someone who cares about this building as much as I do. Several people laughed softly, but this time the laughter carried warmth instead of mockery. Claire nodded. Done. Ethan finally opened the folder, not because of the title written inside or the generous compensation waiting on the final page, but because he now understood what Claire was truly offering. She was not simply inviting him into leadership. She was inviting him to protect the kind of culture his late wife had always hoped the world could become. And as he carefully closed the folder once again, he realized that sometimes the greatest promotions were not measured by a new office or a larger paycheck. Sometimes they were measured by finding people who valued the very promises that had quietly shaped your entire life. When the board meeting finally ended, no one rushed toward the elevators the way they usually did after long executive sessions. Laptops remained closed. Presentation folders stayed untouched. The afternoon had quietly rearranged something inside every person who had entered that room believing leadership could be measured only by titles, credentials, or influence. Ethan Walker gathered nothing except the same small notepad he had carried into the meeting and the family photograph that had remained tucked safely inside his maintenance cart. He thanked each director with the same quiet respect he had shown before anyone knew his story. There was no victory speech. There was no celebration. There was only gratitude. Claire Whitmore watched him leave the boardroom, still walking with the same steady pace he had used that morning while polishing handrails no one noticed. Success had not changed his posture because humility had never depended on circumstance. Before Ethan reached the elevator, Claire called after him. Mr. Walker. He turned with a gentle smile. Yes, ma'am. Claire held out a small white envelope. One more thing. Ethan accepted it with quiet curiosity. Inside was a handwritten note rather than another contract. It contained only a single sentence. Thank you for reminding us that character is the strongest strategy any company will ever have. Ethan folded the note carefully and slipped it into the same pocket where he kept Lily's photograph. I will treasure this, he said softly. Claire nodded. I hoped you would. A few minutes later, Ethan stepped into the familiar parking lot carrying nothing that made him appear different from the man who had arrived before sunrise. His old pickup truck still waited beneath the maple trees with faded paint, worn tires, and a heater that only worked when it felt generous. He smiled as he started the engine and glanced at the dashboard clock. 2:51. He would make it to Lily's school with time to spare. Across the city, the final school bell echoed through the hallways as children hurried toward waiting parents. Lily stepped outside carrying a backpack that looked almost too large for her small shoulders. She searched the line of waiting vehicles until she spotted the old pickup rolling toward the curb. Her face immediately brightened. She waved both hands enthusiastically before running the last few steps. Ethan climbed out, opened the passenger door, and accepted the hug that always came before any conversation. How was your day? He asked. Lily grinned proudly. I got 100 on my science quiz too. Ethan laughed warmly. Looks like I owe you pumpkin ice cream. She climbed into the truck before noticing the unfamiliar leather folder resting carefully on the seat. What is that? She asked. Ethan looked at it for a moment before smiling. Just something from work. Lily tilted her head. Did something good happen? Ethan thought quietly before answering. Yes, but the best part is that I still made it here on time. Lily reached across the seat and squeezed his hand. You always do. Those 3 simple words meant more to Ethan than every impressive title he had ever held. As they drove toward their favorite neighborhood ice cream shop, downtown Chicago slowly disappeared behind them while golden autumn sunlight stretched across the streets ahead. Back inside Ardent Dynamics, the boardroom remained empty except for Claire Whitmore. She stood alone beside the whiteboard where 3 circles still remained exactly as Ethan had drawn them. Company, people, trust. She picked up the black marker and wrote one final sentence beneath them before quietly placing the marker down forever. Dignity grows where respect begins. She smiled to herself, knowing those words would remain on that board until every executive had read them. Months later, visitors entering the headquarters noticed subtle changes throughout the company. Executives regularly visited customer service teams before approving major decisions. Board meetings now included representatives from departments that had previously gone unheard. Employee turnover quietly declined. Customer satisfaction steadily climbed. Profits followed, not because people chased numbers more aggressively, but because they remembered that trust always traveled ahead of revenue. Ethan never asked anyone to tell his story. Most new employees assumed he had always been part of the executive leadership team because he greeted receptionists, interns, custodians, and directors with exactly the same kindness. Claire often smiled whenever she watched new managers discover that the quiet man carrying coffee into a meeting was the advisor whose opinion everyone respected most. The greatest lesson from that remarkable afternoon was never that a janitor possessed hidden brilliance. It was that true greatness had never been hiding at all. It had simply refused to announce itself. Real strength did not demand applause. Real wisdom did not compete for attention. Real leadership quietly lifted other people before lifting itself. And sometimes the most unforgettable moment inside a boardroom was not the sound of applause after an extraordinary revelation. It was the profound silence that arrived when every heart in the room finally recognized the priceless value of quiet dignity.